On the outskirts of a sleepy coastal town, the lighthouse of Marrow's Point had stood abandoned for decades. Its eerie silhouette, outlined against the moonlit sky, was a landmark that locals avoided and tourists found fascinating. Legend had it that the lighthouse keeper, Old Man Marrow, vanished without a trace one stormy night, leaving behind only a cryptic note that read, "They are not what they seem." Lila, an aspiring young horror writer, had just moved to town, renting a small, rustic cabin near the beach. The isolation was perfect for her craft, and the local folklore was an untapped goldmine for inspiration. Lila had heard about Marrow's Point from a chatty neighbor and decided it would be the perfect setting for her next novel. One crisp evening, armed with a flashlight and her trusty notepad, Lila trekked to the lighthouse. As she approached, the air grew inexplicably cold, and the sound of the crashing waves seemed to carry whispers of long-forgotten secrets. The door to the lighthouse was surprisingly unlocked. She stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the thick, musty air, revealing layers of dust and cobwebs. As she ascended the spiral staircase, the eerie quiet was punctuated by the groan of the old metal steps. Reaching the top, she found the lantern room. Its glass was fogged and cracked, but the panoramic view of the ocean was breathtaking. She could imagine Old Man Marrow, standing there, watching for ships that never returned. Setting her backpack down, Lila began to jot down notes. However, as she wrote, she felt an unsettling sensation of being watched. She flashed her light around the room but saw nothing. Deciding she was just spooked by her own story, she continued her work. But then, the lighthouse's long-dead bulb flickered to life, bathing the room in an ominous red glow. Startled, Lila turned just in time to see shadows moving along the walls, forming what looked like human shapes. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was a trick of the light, but the figures were clearer now, whispering amongst themselves. They spoke in a language she couldn't understand, yet their tone was unmistakably urgent. One of the shadows detached from the group, coming towards her. It had the vague outline of a man, dressed in old-fashioned lighthouse keeper's garb. Lila's heart raced as the figure stopped just short of her, its face obscured by darkness. "Leave this place," it hissed, a voice like the wind through dead leaves. Lila, frozen with fear, could only watch as it pointed urgently towards the staircase. Ignoring its warning, Lila's curiosity got the best of her. She asked, "What happened here? Who are you?" The figure paused, and the room grew deathly silent. After a moment, it spoke again, its voice now a desperate plea. "They are coming. You must go." Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from below. The staircase groaned under a new weight. The lighthouse light flickered rapidly, casting wild shadows as Lila scrambled to gather her things. The whispers turned to shouts, and the temperature dropped sharply. As she fled down the stairs, the shadows seemed to chase her, reaching out with smoky hands. Breathing heavily, Lila burst out of the lighthouse and into the night. She didn't stop running until she reached her cabin. Locking the door behind her, she leaned against it, heart pounding. The calm of her cabin offered little comfort, the haunting experience at the lighthouse lingered in her mind. Unable to shake the feeling of dread, Lila sat down to review her notes, only to find them gone. In their place was a single, chilling line in a handwriting not her own, "They are not what they seem." Terrified yet determined, Lila knew she couldn't leave the mystery unsolved. Her own safety, and perhaps the safety of the entire town, might depend on uncovering the truth behind Old Man Marrow's disappearance and the shadows in the lighthouse. As dawn broke the next day, Lila made a decision. She would return to the lighthouse, but she wouldn't go alone. She needed help, and she knew just who to ask, her neighbor, an old fisherman who claimed to know every secret the town held. Together, they would face whatever horrors awaited. With the town's eerie past beginning to weave into her present, Lila was about to discover that some stories, especially those whispered by shadows in abandoned lighthouses, are more than just tales. They are warnings. Lila spent the morning pacing around her cabin, her mind replaying the nightmarish scenes from the lighthouse over and over. She couldn't shake off the cold dread that clung to her, nor could she ignore the cryptic message left in her notebook. By midday, she resolved to visit her neighbor, the old fisherman named Edgar, who had lived in the town all his life and was reputed to know its secrets. She found Edgar repairing nets outside his weathered, seafront cottage. The old man looked up with a squint as Lila approached, his face lined like a map of the ocean currents. "Heard you went up to Merrow's Point last night," he said without preamble, his voice rough like gravel. "Not many dare to tread that path, especially after dark." Lila nodded, her eyes reflecting a mix of fear and resolve. "I saw something there, Edgar. Shadows, they spoke to me," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Edgar paused, his hands stilling on the nets. He studied her for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit beside him on an old, overturned boat. "That lighthouse has been a bad omen for this town since before you were born. Old Man Merrow wasn't the first keeper, you know, and I reckon he might not have been the last." "What do you mean?" Lila pressed, eager for any information that could explain her terrifying encounter. "Legend has it," Edgar began, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "that the lighthouse stands on a spot that's thin, where the veil between this world and something else is weak. Merrow knew it, tried to warn us all with his ramblings and notes. After he vanished, nobody else wanted the job. They sealed it up, thought that would be the end of it. But it wasn't the end, was it?" Lila's voice trembled with both fear and excitement. "No, it wasn't," Edgar confirmed, shaking his head solemnly. "Every now and then, someone sees lights up there, hears voices. Most of us think it's better not to meddle with such things." Lila's mind raced. The lighthouse's history was more complex and darker than she had imagined. "I need to go back there, Edgar. I left something unfinished. And now, it feels like it's calling me back." Edgar looked at her, his eyes reflecting a stormy sea. "I thought you might say that. And I'll go with you. But we need to be prepared. This isn't just about ghost stories or writing your next novel. You're stirring something that's been left alone for a good reason." The two spent the rest of the day gathering supplies, old tomes that Edgar had collected over the years, some containing cryptic references to the lighthouse, and others to rituals and protective charms. As night began to fall, they set out for Merrow's Point once more. The walk to the lighthouse was tense, with every rustle in the dark bushes making Lila jump. Edgar, however, walked with a grim determination, a lantern swinging in his rugged hand. When they arrived at the lighthouse, it loomed even larger and more menacing under the cloak of night. "Stay close," Edgar warned as they entered. The inside of the lighthouse felt colder than the outside air, and Lila's breath misted in front of her. As they ascended the spiral staircase, the air grew denser, and the faint murmur of voices began to echo through the walls. Reaching the lantern room, they found it just as Lila had left it, save for the atmosphere that now thrummed with a palpable intensity. Edgar set the lantern down and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "We need to make a circle," he instructed, his hands trembling slightly as he drew symbols on the dusty floor with chalk. Lila watched, her heart pounding in her chest, as Edgar chanted words in a language she didn't understand. The air in the room thickened, the shadows deepened, and the whispers grew louder. Suddenly, a cold gust swept through the room, extinguishing the lantern and plunging them into darkness. "Edgar?" Lila whispered, her voice quivering. "Hold my hand and don't let go," came Edgar's steady reply. She felt his rough hand grip hers as the shadows began to move again, swirling around the edges of the room, drawing closer with each passing second. The whispers became shouts, and among them, Lila could now discern distinct words. "Bound," they said, "bound and waiting." The circle Edgar had drawn seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, the only source of light in the otherwise pitch-black room. The shadows hesitated at its edge, swirling angrily. "What are they waiting for?" Lila asked, her voice barely loud enough to be heard over the cacophony. Edgar's voice was steady, a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around them. "For the veil to thin further, for the right conditions, or the right person," he explained. "This lighthouse, it's more than just a beacon for ships. It's a beacon for them, too." Lila's grip tightened on Edgar's hand as the shadows pressed against the invisible barrier of their protective circle. The air was thick with the power of the unspoken and unseen, the floor beneath them vibrating with the force of the entities gathered. "Why me? Why are they interested in me?" Lila's voice broke with the strain of fear and confusion. Edgar glanced at her, his eyes reflecting the faint, eerie glow of the chalk markings. "Sometimes, it's not about who you are but what you represent. Your curiosity, your presence here, it might be what they needed, someone to acknowledge them, to challenge the boundaries they're confined by." As he spoke, one of the shadows seemed to pierce through the circle momentarily, its form more defined, almost human, its whisper distinguishable from the rest. "Freedom," it hissed, the word echoing around the room before the shadow recoiled as if burned by the barrier. "We need to reinforce the circle," Edgar said hurriedly, reaching into his bag for a small pouch of salt, which he began to sprinkle around them. The salt hissed as it hit the ground, emitting a faint light. Lila felt the intensity of the room shift slightly, the air becoming momentarily breathable as the shadows recoiled with the strengthening of the circle. Yet, the reprieve was brief, the entities regrouped, their whispers turning into a drone that seemed to shake the very foundation of the lighthouse. "Listen to me, Lila," Edgar's voice cut through the noise. "These entities, they're bound here by something ancient, a pact perhaps, or a curse. If they're seeking freedom, it might not be safe to release them. We don't know what they are or what they're capable of. But what do they want from me?" Lila asked again, her voice desperate for answers. "Either to use you as a key to their release or—" Edgar paused, his expression grave, to replace someone who might have once held their chains. A cold realization washed over Lila. Old Man Marrow? Possibly, Edgar nodded solemnly. If he was their keeper, their jailer, his disappearance might have weakened their bonds but not enough to break them. Your arrival, your energy, might be what they've been waiting for. The shadows surged again, and a low, mournful moan rose from the depths of the lighthouse, the sound bone-chilling and otherworldly. The circle flickered under the assault, the salt and chalk struggling to maintain their sanctity. "We need to make a decision," Edgar shouted over the din. "Do we attempt to communicate further, or do we try to seal them again, possibly stronger this time?" Lila's mind raced. The danger was clear, but so was the opportunity to understand more, to potentially free these trapped souls or whatever they were, and in doing so, uncover the true history of the lighthouse. "Let's try to communicate," she decided, her voice firm despite her shaking hands. "We need to understand exactly what we're dealing with." Nodding, Edgar began to chant again, his words loud and commanding. The shadows hesitated, then, as if compelled, began to merge into a single, more coherent form. The figure that emerged was taller than a man, its features blurred but its presence overwhelming. "Why are you bound?" Edgar demanded. The figure's response came in a voice that was both everywhere and nowhere, a cold, endless whisper that seemed to seep into Lila's very soul. "Betrayal. Punishment. Waiting for release or replacement." What would release entail? Edgar pressed on, his voice steady. The shadows around the figure seemed to pulse. A new keeper, or the breaking of the old seals. The room fell silent, the weight of the entity's words hanging heavily in the air. Lila and Edgar exchanged a glance, both understanding the gravity of their next choices. This was no longer just about a ghost story or a forgotten legend. They were standing at the precipice of something much larger, much older, and infinitely more dangerous. As they pondered their next move, the ground beneath them trembled, a deep, resonating thud that suggested the awakening of something even more formidable. The lighthouse itself seemed to groan under the strain, a sound that echoed up its spiral staircase and into the dark, starless night above. With the shadows watching and waiting, Lila and Edgar prepared to delve deeper into the mystery, unaware that each step forward was drawing them closer to a truth that might have been better left undiscovered. The trembling beneath their feet grew stronger, more insistent, as if the very foundation of the lighthouse itself were awakening from a long slumber. The shadows around the figure began to swirl faster, their whispers becoming screams that pierced the air like knives. Edgar continued his incantations, but his voice was drowned out by the cacophony of the restless spirits. Lila, driven by a mix of fear and determination, stepped forward. "What do you need to be free?" she asked the figure, her voice cutting through the chaos. The figure paused, its swirling shadows slowing as it considered her. "A sacrifice," it finally hissed, the words chilling Lila to her core. "A sacrifice?" Edgar repeated, his tone wary. He glanced at Lila, a silent warning in his eyes. The figure nodded, its form becoming more defined, more menacing. "The Keeper's blood," it elaborated, and the shadows around it writhed in anticipation. Lila felt her heart skip a beat. "Are you saying Marrow was killed here?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Not killed," the figure corrected her, its voice a mocking echo. "Transformed. Bound to us, as we are bound to this place. His spirit, his essence, fuels our chains. Another must take his place, or the chains must be broken completely." The revelation hit Lila like a wave crashing against the cliffs below. She understood now the true nature of the lighthouse's curse and the terrible choice that lay before her. Freeing these entities might mean taking on a burden she could never escape, or worse, it might unleash something upon the world that should remain confined. I need to think," she stammered, stepping back toward Edgar. But before she could retreat further, the ground shook violently, a clear sign that their time was running out. Cracks appeared in the walls of the lighthouse, dust and debris falling around them as the structure protested the strain of the supernatural forces at play. Edgar grabbed Lila's arm, pulling her toward him. "We don't have much time," he shouted over the noise. "This place is coming apart." "We need to seal it," Lila yelled back, her decision made in the face of impending disaster. "We can't let them out." Nodding in agreement, Edgar quickly directed her to help him strengthen the circle with more salt and chalk while he resumed his chanting with renewed vigor. The shadows screamed in anger and frustration as their form began to dissolve, merging back into the darkness as the seal tightened. With one final, powerful chant from Edgar, a bright flash of light filled the room, blinding Lila momentarily. When she could see again, the shadows were gone, and the room was silent save for the sound of their heavy breathing and the distant roar of the ocean. They had managed to reinforce the seal, but at what cost? The lighthouse was severely damaged, its integrity compromised. As they made their way down the spiral staircase, Lila felt a profound sadness for the spirits they had reconfined and for Old Man Marrow, whose fate was now clear to her. Outside, the storm had passed, and the first light of dawn painted the sky in hues of orange and pink. Lila and Edgar stood looking at the lighthouse, its silhouette less menacing in the light of day but forever changed in their eyes. "We did what we had to do," Edgar said finally, breaking the silence. Lila nodded, but her heart was heavy. "We did," she agreed. "But this isn't over, is it?" Edgar shook his head. "No, I don't think it ever really is. These places, these stories, they have a way of holding on, of coming back." As they walked back to the village, the lighthouse stood behind them, a silent sentinel on the cliff. It was bound to the earth by stone and mortar, but bound to the supernatural by something much stronger. Lila knew she would be back, drawn by the mystery and by a desire to one day set the trapped spirits free. But that story was for another time. For now, the lighthouse of Marrow's Point was quiet, its secrets locked away once more in the shadows, waiting for the next curious soul brave enough to uncover them.